It's strange how something so normal and routine, just stepping into your own car, turning the ignition, heading to work or the grocery store, can suddenly become a turning point in your life. I never thought I'd be one of those people who tell stories like this, the kind that start with something mundane and spiral into chaos. But here I am, recounting the exact moment my life shifted, not because of some car crash or natural disaster, but because someone I loved, someone I trusted, decided I was expendable. And the worst part? They didn't just hurt me emotionally. They kicked me out of my own car, drove away laughing, and left me standing on the sidewalk, stunned, betrayed, and still legally the owner of the vehicle they just stole. But let me take you back a little further. Before the humiliation, before the paperwork, before the police reports and sleepless nights, back when things felt good, maybe even too good. Her name was Kate. She was that kind of person who could walk into a room and make everyone look her way, not because she was the loudest, not even necessarily the most beautiful by conventional standards, but because she had this presence, this way of making you feel like you were the most interesting person in the world just by locking eyes with you. That's how she got me. Not with games or manipulation at first, but with attention, genuine, disarming attention. And when you're someone like me, steady job, quiet life, maybe a little too responsible for your own good, that kind of attention feels like being chosen in a world that usually just walks right past you. We met through mutual friends, the kind of weekend gathering that starts with too many chips and not enough beer. Everyone sitting in mismatched chairs around a fire pit. She sat next to me and started asking questions. Not the usual small talk, but thoughtful ones. About what I liked to do when I wasn't working, whether I was more of a mountains or ocean type, what my favorite memory from childhood was. By the end of the night, she had me wrapped around her little finger, and I didn't even realize it. It didn't feel like game playing. It felt like connection. Looking back now, I think she had a way of making everyone feel that way. But I thought I was special. That was my first mistake. Things moved quickly, as they always do in stories like these. Within 3 months, we were practically living together, though technically she still kept her apartment across town. I never questioned it. I thought maybe she needed her space, or just hadn't gotten around to officially moving out. In reality, she was keeping it as a backup, a place to land in case things didn't go her way. But I didn't know that yet. I thought we were building a life together. We went grocery shopping as a team, had our shows, we watched every week, even hosted a couple of dinner parties that made me feel like we were really becoming adults. Stable, reliable, maybe even happy. One of the biggest steps we took together came about 9 months in. I had been talking about replacing my old car for a while. It was functional, but tired. A hand-me-down sedan that had gotten me through college, my first real job, and more than one road trip disaster. Kate was the one who pushed me to finally do it. "You deserve something new," she said. "Something that's you." She even came with me to the dealership, helped me test drive a few different models, negotiated with the sales rep like she had done it 100 times before. I was impressed. She seemed so competent, so confident, and when she suggested that she could help me out with gas and maintenance if I let her use the car too, I didn't think twice. We were a team, right? We were building something. So I bought the car, a shiny dark gray Honda CR-V, almost brand new, and put the title solely in my name. It made sense. The financing was through my bank, the credit was in my name, and besides, it was technically my purchase. But in practice, we treated it like a shared asset. She had her own set of keys, she drove it just as much as I did, maybe more. At the time, that felt like partnership. Now I see it was the beginning of the end. Over time, there were signs that things were off. Nothing glaring at first, just little things. She started changing the presets on the car's radio without asking. even though she knew I hated pop country. She left receipts in the glove box for places I'd never been. Fancy lunch spots, out-of-town parking garages, sometimes two in the same day in opposite directions. She brushed it off when I asked, I was with a friend, or I just needed to get out of the house for a while. I didn't push. I told myself that everyone deserves their privacy, their independence. I didn't want to be controlling, but part of me knew something wasn't right. Then came the shift. She started disappearing for long stretches, sometimes not coming home until 2 or 3 a.m., claiming she had been out with friends or working late on some freelance gig. But I never saw her bring in any money. She became defensive, even hostile, whenever I questioned her. And still, I held on. I told myself we were just going through a rough patch, that if I just gave her space, things would settle. I was wrong. Things didn't settle. They escalated. The night it happened, the night she took the car and didn't come back, felt almost ordinary. We had dinner, takeout from her favorite Thai place. We watched half an episode of something she liked. Then she said she was going to run out for a bit. No explanation, no time frame. She kissed me on the cheek and grabbed the car keys off the hook. That was it. I didn't even think to stop her. Why would I? She had done it a dozen times before. But this time she didn't come back. Not that night, not the next morning, not ever, really. At first I was worried. I called, texted. No response. I thought something had happened to her. Maybe a car accident. Maybe she'd lost her phone. It wasn't like her to just vanish. But then, the next evening, I saw it. A notification from Instagram. She had posted a story. A video of her in my car, our car, laughing hysterically, filming some guy I had never seen before, behind the wheel. Road trip vibes, the caption read, followed by a bunch of laughing emojis. In the background, I could hear her voice say, "Thanks, baby. This ride is so much better now." And then, silence. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. She had taken my car, picked up some new guy, and left me behind without a word. They were laughing like I was a joke, like I was some pathetic footnote in their little getaway. That was the moment the numbness started. A sort of detached fog settled over everything. I wasn't just angry. I was humiliated, confused, heartbroken. How do you even begin to process something like that? How do you accept that someone you loved, someone you let into your home, your bed, your finances, your life, could turn around and do something so cruel? I wanted answers. I wanted the car back. I wanted closure. But above all, I wanted to believe that I hadn't just been a fool. And yet, in that lowest moment, there was one small, shining detail that gave me hope. My name was still on the title. No matter how far they drove, no matter how loudly they laughed, that car was still mine. Legally, financially, undeniably. They might have taken the keys, but they hadn't taken everything. Not yet. After the initial shock wore off and the numbness began to fade into a more focused kind of despair, I found myself pacing around my apartment with a sick feeling in my stomach and 1,000 questions in my head, none of which had answers that made any sense. How long had she been planning this? Was this something spontaneous? A reckless decision fueled by emotion and impulse? Or had she been setting this up for weeks, maybe even months? And who was the guy in the video? Someone new? Someone I had unknowingly crossed paths with while living under the same roof as the woman I thought I loved? I couldn't stop replaying the footage in my mind, her laughter ringing in my ears, the casual cruelty in her voice, as she leaned into the camera like this was all some joke. A prank pulled on a clueless man too naive to see what was coming. My first instinct was to call her again. I picked up the phone a dozen times, hovered my thumb over her name, stared at the contact photo that suddenly felt like it belonged to a stranger, and each time I put it down again. What would I even say? What could I say that wouldn't just further expose my own humiliation? I imagined her not picking up, or worse, picking up and laughing again, taunting me with more videos, more cryptic one-liners about how life moves on. So I didn't call. Instead, I sat down and started gathering every document I had related to the car. The purchase agreement, the title, the insurance information, my credit union statement showing the monthly payments being withdrawn like clockwork from my account. I needed to remind myself that whatever she thought she had taken, it was still mine. The next morning, I drove my old beater of a car, the one I had been so excited to replace, to the local police station. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, though my voice wavered in places and I probably looked like I hadn't slept in days. The officer at the front desk, a woman in her late 40s with tired eyes and a clipped tone, asked me a few basic questions and typed everything into the computer. When I told her my girlfriend had taken the car and hadn't returned it, she raised an eyebrow and asked if I had reported it stolen. I hesitated. That word, stolen, felt too extreme, too final. This was someone I had shared my life with. Someone I had trusted enough to give a key to. Could it really be called theft if I had once handed her the keys willingly? But the officer didn't hesitate. If she took your vehicle without your permission, and you no longer have access to it, she said flatly, that's unauthorized use at best, grand theft auto at worst. Do you want to file a report? I nodded. I didn't like the way the words sounded, but I knew I had to do it. I wasn't just dealing with a bad breakup or a messy fight. This was different. This was betrayal, weaponized with a motor vehicle. And the only way I could take back control of the situation was by following the process, however painful and humiliating it might be. The report took nearly an hour to complete. I gave them every detail I could think of, even pulled up the Instagram story she had posted as proof. The officer watched it with an impassive expression, jotted down some notes, and said they'd see what they could do. Walking out of the station, I expected to feel some sense of relief, maybe even empowerment. Instead, I just felt tired. Not physically, but somewhere deeper. Like a part of me had finally accepted that the version of reality I had been clinging to was gone for good. I wasn't going to wake up tomorrow and find her sitting on the couch with coffee and an apology. She wasn't coming back with the car. She wasn't going to explain. She had chosen a path that didn't include me, and the sooner I stopped hoping for clarity, the sooner I could begin cleaning up the mess she left behind. The days that followed were a blur of logistics. I called my insurance company and explained the situation again. The representative was polite but cold, reading off policy guidelines in a tone that suggested this kind of thing happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. Because the car was still technically in my possession in a legal sense, even if it wasn't physically in front of me, there were limits to what they could do. I wasn't covered for theft by a known party, which felt like a cruel technicality. I also had to keep making payments on the car loan, regardless of whether I was driving it or not. That hit me hardest. Every month, a few $100s were disappearing from my account so some guy I didn't know could drive around with my ex-girlfriend, pretending my life never existed. I started receiving notifications from toll booths. Apparently, they had driven the car out of state. I saw charges from gas stations in cities I'd never been to, each one another small punch to the gut. I compiled everything into a folder, screenshots of their social media posts, toll charges, gas receipts, the police report, emails from my bank. I didn't know what I was building. A case, maybe, or just a lifeboat of evidence to keep myself from drowning in the chaos. Then, about a week after she left, I got a message on Facebook. It was from someone I didn't know, a guy named Aaron. He said he used to date Kate too, and that he had heard what happened through mutual friends. At first I was suspicious. The last thing I needed was another person complicating the situation. But what he said made my blood run cold. According to him, Kate had done something similar to him. Not with a car, but with money. She had convinced him to co-sign a lease on an apartment she had no intention of living in long term. Once the place was furnished and the utilities set up in his name, she vanished, moved in with someone else. He was left footing the bill for a place she no longer occupied. "She knows exactly what she's doing," he wrote. "You're not the first." That was the moment I realized this wasn't some fluke. It wasn't a one-off lapse in judgment. Kate was running patterns, repeating behaviors, and leaving a trail of financial and emotional destruction wherever she went. And now I was just the latest mark. I forwarded Aaron's message to the police, not sure if it would even matter, but it mattered to me. It gave me context. It gave me clarity. I stopped looking at her as the woman I had loved and started seeing her as what she had become, a predator of opportunity. It hurt, more than I can describe, to admit that to myself. But the truth has a way of slicing through denial when you need it most. Things moved quickly after that. The officer assigned to my case followed up a few days later to let me know they had tracked the car. It had been found parked outside a motel 2 counties over. They had impounded it, and I could come retrieve it once I provided proof of ownership and paid the towing fee. I didn't care about the fee. I would have emptied my savings just to get that car back. Not because of its material value, but because of what it represented. Closure. When I finally saw it again, it looked different. Not damaged exactly, but lived in by people who didn't care about it. Fast food wrappers were stuffed into the door pockets. The air freshener had been changed to something overly sweet and nauseating. My registration papers were crumpled in the glove box like garbage. It didn't feel like mine anymore, but it was. Legally, undeniably mine. That night, driving it home, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow. I had won, technically. I had taken back what was mine. But I had also lost time, money, trust. The version of myself that believed people like Kate only existed in cautionary tales. I had become one of those tales, and now all I could do was tell it. You'd think that getting the car back would be the end of the story, or at least the beginning of the end. I had gone through the motions, filed the police report, gathered the paperwork, jumped through the bureaucratic hoops, paid the fees, endured the emotional fallout of seeing something I'd once been proud of reduced to a mobile garbage bin by 2 people who treated it like a rental with no return policy. But no, that wasn't the conclusion. That was barely the midpoint. What I didn't know then was that getting the car back was just the beginning of an entirely new layer of chaos. Because Kate wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. She wasn't going to disappear quietly into the night, tail between her legs, letting me have the last word. That would have required a level of shame or self-awareness I'm not sure she even possessed. Instead, she doubled down as if stealing my car, abandoning our relationship, and humiliating me publicly weren't enough. And somehow her next move was even more brazen than everything that had come before. It started with a phone call, not from her, but from a mutual friend, Jason, who had always remained somewhere on the outskirts of our social circle, not quite close enough to be part of the inner ring, but not far enough to be excluded from group texts or birthdays. I hadn't spoken to him since Kate left. He'd texted a couple times with the standard, "You good man?" messages, but I hadn't responded. So when his name lit up my phone that afternoon, I hesitated before answering. When I did, I was greeted with silence at first, followed by a hesitant voice that sounded like it had been rehearsing the next sentence for hours. "I think you need to know what she's saying about you," he said, and in that moment, I felt the floor beneath me shift. According to Jason, Kate had been reaching out to people we both knew, mutual friends, acquaintances, even some of my coworkers who had only met her once or twice, telling them that I had abused her. Not physically, but emotionally, mentally, psychologically. She was painting herself as the victim of a controlling partner who had gaslit her, isolated her from her friends, and then retaliated when she tried to leave. She was saying that I reported the car stolen out of spite, that I had used the system to punish her for exercising her independence. The way Jason said it, slowly, reluctantly, almost apologetically, made it clear he didn't know what to believe, but the fact that he even had doubts felt like another betrayal. I didn't scream or argue. I just thanked him for letting me know and hung up. Then I sat there, staring at the wall, letting the implications wash over me like acid. She wasn't just trying to ruin my credit or steal a vehicle. She was going after my reputation, my identity, the core of how people saw me. And worse, she was doing it in ways that were difficult to disprove. You can't exactly pull out a spreadsheet and say, "See?" I wasn't emotionally abusive. There's no legal document for that. And the thing about accusations like that is simple. People don't need proof to believe them. All they need is the seed of doubt. The next week was a minefield. I started getting weird looks at work. One coworker who used to joke around with me in the break room now avoided eye contact. Another, a woman I had worked with on several projects, asked me point blank if everything at home had really been okay. I didn't know how to answer. I hadn't even told them she'd left. Now suddenly I was fending off vague whispers about things I hadn't said, hadn't done, hadn't even imagined possible. I wanted to scream, to send out a mass message declaring the truth, listing every receipt and document and time-stamped photo. But I knew how that would look. The more you defend yourself against lies, the more you sound like someone who's hiding something. That's the trap. That's the genius of the tactic. She didn't need people to believe the whole story, just enough of it to make them question whether the guy they thought they knew was really who he claimed to be. I didn't sleep for days. I replayed conversations we'd had, moments I'd brushed off, arguments I thought were resolved. I began to wonder if maybe I had said things I shouldn't have, even if I never meant them in the way she claimed. That's the worst part about being gaslit. Eventually, you start doing it to yourself. The difference was, now I was doing it in response to someone gaslighting others about me. And then came the next escalation, an email from a legal office. Not a lawyer I knew, not someone I'd ever spoken to, but a real firm with a real letterhead and a message that nearly made me vomit when I read it. Kate had filed a claim stating that she had an equitable interest in the car and was requesting a portion of its value, or else she would pursue legal action for reimbursement. She included receipts, gas fill-ups, oil changes, car washes. Nothing substantial, just enough to suggest she had contributed to its maintenance, and therefore, in her view, its ownership. The letter wasn't written aggressively. It was calculated, precise, and civil to a fault, which somehow made it even more terrifying. She was trying to legitimize the theft, trying to rewrite the narrative in a way that cast her as a partner who had been wronged by an overzealous ex. And she was doing it through official channels now, not just whispers and social media posts. That changed everything. I hired a lawyer the next day. It wasn't cheap, and I had to dip into my emergency fund to cover the retainer, but I needed someone who could push back on her fiction with fact. My attorney, an older man named Harris, with a calm, gravelly voice and a deep reservoir of experience, reviewed everything I gave him and offered a single piece of advice that stuck with me more than anything else. Don't respond emotionally. She's baiting you into a public reaction she can use against you. Stay quiet. Stay documented. And let us handle it. It was hard, so hard, to keep my mouth shut when all I wanted to do was scream. But I listened. I documented. I saved everything. And I waited. Then came the final straw, or what I thought was the final straw at the time. A letter showed up at my door, not from her, but from the DMV. It said there had been an attempt to file a duplicate title for the vehicle. Someone had filled out the form claiming the original had been lost, submitted copies of documents, some of which were forged, as we later confirmed, and even paid the expedited processing fee. The only reason it hadn't gone through was because my signature had been flagged as inconsistent. They were trying to take the car again. Not physically this time, but legally, trying to cut me out of my own property on paper the way they had already tried to do in practice. That was when the anger finally broke through the fog. Not grief, not humiliation, not self-doubt. Just pure, focused, righteous anger. I gathered every scrap of documentation I had, text messages where she admitted to using the car, screenshots of her Instagram stories, receipts that showed I had made every loan payment, the police report, the towing invoice, even the phone records, showing how many times I had tried to reach her when she disappeared. My lawyer compiled it all into a formal cease and desist letter. We also submitted a fraud alert to the DMV and demanded an investigation. The moment we filed, everything shifted. It wasn't just about a breakup anymore. It wasn't even about the car. It was about the principle of it, about not letting someone rewrite history just because they think no one will stop them. And that was when the silence started. No more social media posts, no more whispers, no new messages from mutual friends or passive-aggressive digs from strangers. It was as if, once confronted with real resistance, she simply evaporated. Part of me wanted to believe that meant she had finally realized the game was over. But another part, the more cautious part, knew better. This wasn't the end. This was just the eye of the storm. Silence has a strange way of playing tricks on the mind. At first it felt like a reprieve, a temporary ceasefire in a war I never volunteered to fight. After the legal pushback, after the fraudulent title application was flagged and stopped, after the cease and desist letter was delivered and acknowledged, everything went quiet. No new stories, no late-night texts from mutual friends trying to warn me about what Kate was saying behind my back. No unexpected toll charges or strange attempts to access my car. It was as if she'd finally accepted that she couldn't win, or at least not in the way she wanted to. But even in the quiet, I didn't feel safe. I felt watched. Not literally, not in the paranoid sense that someone was outside my window or following me on the street, but in a deeper, more insidious way. Like I had become a character in someone else's story, a plot device, in a version of events I had no control over. I'd won the first round, maybe the second, but I still didn't know what the end game was. That's what kept me awake most nights. Not fear of another direct attack, but the uncertainty of what she might still be planning and who she might be planning it with. In the meantime, I focused on rebuilding. That sounds neat and inspiring on paper, but in reality, it was slow, awkward, and often discouraging. I was still paying off the car, my car, the one that now felt more like a crime scene than a source of freedom, and every payment was a reminder not of ownership, but of what had been taken from me. I tried cleaning it out, replacing the air freshener, vacuuming the seats, even getting it detailed professionally. But it still smelled faintly of her perfume. The residue of someone else's recklessness isn't something that comes out with soap and suction. It lingers. Like regret. Like memory. Like trauma disguised as upholstery. Socially, things were fractured. Some friends had taken my side unequivocally, offering support and solidarity, and the kind of quiet loyalty that doesn't show up in grand gestures, but in consistent presence. Others stayed neutral, either out of discomfort or cowardice, I never bothered to ask which. And then there were those who drifted away entirely, as if my involvement in something messy had rendered me contagious. I didn't chase them. I didn't correct the record. I let them go. Because at that point, I had realized something important. Anyone who needed to be convinced of the truth wasn't someone I wanted near me when things got hard. At work, things slowly stabilized. My performance had taken a hit during the worst of the ordeal, and I knew it. Missed deadlines, skipped meetings, moments where I would blank out entirely and forget what I was supposed to be doing. But I kept my head down, stayed late when I had to, and let results speak louder than rumors. Eventually, the fog lifted, or at least thinned. I started hearing jokes again in the break room. I got invited to a birthday lunch. My manager pulled me aside one Friday and said, "Glad to see you coming back to life." I nodded and thanked him, but I didn't say what I was really thinking. I didn't feel alive. Not yet. Just less dead than before. Then, out of nowhere, the silence broke. Not with noise, but with a message. A single text. From Kate. No emojis. No punctuation. Just, "Can we talk?" My first reaction was a spike of adrenaline. Not excitement or fear exactly, but a kind of visceral alertness, like my body remembered before my brain had time to process. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the weight of those 4 words pressed down on me like a trapdoor creaking underfoot. I didn't respond. Not immediately. I let the message sit there, unread but impossible to ignore. A glowing reminder that this story wasn't finished, just paused. Later that evening, I showed the text to my lawyer. He advised me not to engage directly, especially not over text. "If she wants to talk, it should be through counsel," he said firmly. "She's not reaching out to apologize. She's laying bait. Don't bite." And yet, a part of me wanted to, not because I needed closure, at least not in the traditional sense, but because I still didn't understand why. Why the betrayal? Why the escalation? Why the lies? Why the cruelty? I wasn't naive enough to expect honesty, but I wanted to hear her voice. I wanted to know what version of reality she had told herself to justify everything she had done. But in the end, I followed my lawyer's advice. I didn't respond. I archived the message and blocked the number. Whatever conversation she wanted to have, it wasn't going to be on her terms. Days passed, then a week. I thought maybe that was the end of it. A last gasp before retreat. But then came the message to my employer. I was called into HR for a routine check-in, which turned out to be anything but. Apparently, someone had sent an anonymous email accusing me of workplace misconduct. Nothing specific, just vague references to a pattern of aggression and potential harassment. The HR rep was professional, but clearly skeptical. She asked if there was anyone who might have a reason to target me or fabricate something like this. I told her the truth. About the breakup, the legal mess, the character assassination campaign that had followed. She listened, nodded, took notes, and said they'd review everything carefully. I left the meeting feeling like I'd been splashed with cold water, not fired, not reprimanded, but flagged, watched. That night, the silence in my apartment felt different. Not tense, not ominous, but charged, like the pause between lightning and thunder. I realized then that this wasn't going to end with a single confrontation. There wouldn't be a climactic showdown where all the lies unraveled and justice neatly prevailed. This wasn't a movie. This was real life. And in real life, damage doesn't announce itself. It spreads quietly, invisibly, until you find yourself questioning whether you're actually still bleeding or just remembering what it felt like. And yet, despite everything, despite the betrayal, the smears, the sabotage, I wasn't broken. I was bent, sure, worn down, changed. But something inside me had hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to defend myself to people who didn't care to hear the truth. I had lost time, money, trust, and more than a few nights of sleep. But I hadn't lost myself. Not fully. And if there was any justice left to claim, I would find it. Not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Because some stories don't end when you reclaim what's yours. Some stories only start when you realize what can never be taken again. If you've ever been in a situation where everything looks calm on the surface but feels like it's rotting underneath, then you'll understand exactly where I was. After the initial legal maneuvers, after the lies, after the smear campaign and the HR meeting at work that left my gut twisted for days, I entered a stretch of time that was harder than any open confrontation. Because nothing was happening, at least not overtly, and yet I felt as though I was under siege every waking hour. The silence had returned, but it was no longer the silence of resolution. It was the silence of calculation, of someone waiting for their moment. And I was stuck in limbo, constantly second-guessing everything I said, every email I sent, every person I spoke to, wondering if they'd already been poisoned by her version of the story. It's an impossible state to maintain for long without losing pieces of yourself. What made it worse was that Kate hadn't vanished. I hadn't heard directly from her since that cryptic "Can we talk?" message, but she was still out there, posting, sharing, hinting. Her social media remained public, either out of carelessness or arrogance, and despite every attempt I made to avoid her digital shadow, friends would forward things to me, sometimes out of concern, sometimes out of idle curiosity, like it was entertainment. They didn't understand that every post she made, every smiling picture, every cryptic quote about healing from narcissistic abuse or reclaiming your truth was a knife twisted under my ribs. One video in particular nearly sent me over the edge. She was sitting in a car, my car, though now stripped of the seat covers and stickers I had picked out, laughing with two friends saying, "It's funny how people think they own things just because their name is on the paperwork." They all laughed, like it was the punchline to an inside joke, and maybe it was. Because I finally understood. This wasn't about the car or the relationship or even the money. This was about power. This was about rewriting the story so thoroughly that even I started to question what had really happened. The second wave didn't hit like a bomb. It came like a tide, slow, steady, and impossible to hold back. The first ripple was a voicemail from someone I didn't know, a woman named Tasha, who identified herself as an advocate from a domestic survivors organization. She said Kate had listed me as her former partner in a claim she had filed for financial hardship support, and that they were contacting me for verification. I was stunned. I didn't even know what to say. I asked for documentation, which she said she couldn't provide without Kate's consent. I asked what Kate had said. Again, privacy laws. I told her I wasn't comfortable confirming or denying anything without knowing the context. Tasha's voice cooled immediately, and the call ended shortly after. But I was left with the chilling realization that Kate wasn't just telling stories to friends anymore. She was building systems around her lies, using institutions, weaponizing the very structures meant to protect the vulnerable in order to solidify her narrative. And the worst part? She was smart enough to know exactly how to frame things so that everything I did in response looked like retaliation. 2 days later, I got a call from my landlord. Someone had filed a noise complaint against me. Apparently, I'd been shouting at women, slamming doors, and creating a hostile environment. I live alone. I don't throw parties. I keep to myself. The landlord said he wasn't taking any action, but was obligated to let me know it had been logged. He didn't sound like he believed it, but again, seed planted. And once it's planted, there's no pulling it out without leaving damage behind. I called my lawyer again, this time not out of panic, but cold, calculated resolve. We reviewed everything. The voicemail from the advocate, the noise complaint, the message to HR, the fraudulent title attempt, the social media references, the texts I had archived. We laid it out like a timeline, a slow-burning strategy designed not to destroy me all at once, but to corrode me, drip by drip, until I cracked under the weight of it. Harris, the lawyer, leaned back in his chair and said, "This isn't random. She's building something. Whether it's legal leverage, public sympathy, or just a twisted form of control, she's playing a long game." And he was right. It wasn't about immediate gain. It was about reshaping the reality around me until her version became the dominant one, until the truth didn't matter. And still, I didn't respond directly. That was the hardest part. Not defending myself felt like weakness, like letting her win, but I understood that any emotional outburst, any public retaliation, would be used to reinforce her story. So I focused on building my own version of reality, one backed by documents, dates, screenshots, timelines, statements from people who had seen what really happened. I requested my own copy of the police report. I filed a formal complaint with the DMV regarding the fraudulent attempt. I asked my HR department for a written summary of the anonymous report and my official response to it. I created a digital folder with everything. Not just for court, not just for my lawyer, but for me. Proof that I hadn't imagined all this, that I hadn't overreacted, that I wasn't the person she was painting me to be. But it wasn't just paperwork I had to contend with. The emotional toll of living in constant defense mode started to seep into everything. I found myself flinching when people said my name, hesitating before expressing strong opinions in meetings, second-guessing casual conversations for fear they might be misinterpreted. I became quieter, more inward, less trusting. Not out of bitterness, but out of exhaustion. It's hard to explain to people who haven't lived through it, but when someone tries to erase you, not just from their life, but from the truth itself, it changes how you move through the world. You start conserving energy, not because you're weak, but because you can't afford to waste it on people who might already see you through a distorted lens. Then, just when I thought the worst had passed, the final escalation arrived. This time in the form of an in-person encounter. I hadn't seen Kate since the day she walked out with the keys. I had imagined it 1,000 times. Accidentally running into her at the grocery store, seeing her across the street, bumping into her at a mutual friend's event. But when it finally happened, it wasn't cinematic. It was cold, clinical, calculated. I was walking back to my apartment from the gym, earbuds in, hoodie up, focused on nothing but the ache in my legs and the promise of a shower, when I saw her standing by the entrance to my building, alone. No friends, no camera, just her, waiting. I stopped several yards away, instinctively pulling my hood back, like I needed to see clearly to know this was real. She smiled, not warmly, not regretfully, but with a thin, practiced curve that meant nothing and everything. "You've made this really complicated," she said. No greeting, no preamble, just that. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just stared. "You didn't have to make it a war," she added. "We could have worked something out." I wanted to laugh, to scream, to ask if she was seriously suggesting that I had escalated things. But I didn't give her the satisfaction. "I'm not talking to you," I said flatly. Anything else goes through my lawyer." She rolled her eyes, like I was being dramatic, like this was still some petty argument between two immature adults. And then, in a voice so casual it felt rehearsed, she said, "You know, I could still say a lot of things. People listen to me now." That was it. No threats, no raised voice, just an open-ended statement delivered like a weather report. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back, but my heart didn't stop pounding for hours. Later, when I told Harris about the encounter, he looked at me with something between admiration and concern. "That was bait," he said, "and you didn't take it. That's good, but don't let your guard down. She's not finished." And again he was right, because it wasn't about winning. Not anymore. It was about survival, about narrative control, about who gets to define what happened when the dust finally settles and everyone stops paying attention. The second escalation wasn't explosive. It wasn't a single event. It was the slow erosion of every safe space I had left, social, professional, emotional. It was a campaign of perception, waged by someone who understood that sometimes the most effective lies are the ones told in whispers, scattered across different rooms, layered just thinly enough that they don't invite scrutiny. And in the face of that, all I had was documentation, discipline, and the increasingly fragile belief that truth, in the end, still mattered. There comes a point in any prolonged conflict, not just a fight, not a disagreement, but a sustained psychological siege, where you stop asking when it will end and start wondering whether the person you're up against even remembers why it started. The problem with people like Kate is that they don't need a clear motive or a defined objective. They only need momentum. And once they've created a narrative that works in their favor, they'll keep pushing it forward, not out of necessity, but out of habit. Like someone still playing a game long after forgetting the rules. And by the time I reached what I now recognize as the true breaking point, the actual culmination, not the dramatized courtroom standoff or the Instagram expose I had once imagined, I wasn't just exhausted. I was transformed. Not into someone better or wiser, necessarily, but into someone more precise, more controlled, more willing to face darkness without flinching. Because flinching, I had learned, was exactly what she was waiting for. What triggered the final act wasn't dramatic at first glance. It was just a letter. But not just any letter. This one came certified, with legal formatting and a watermark and a polite yet deeply sinister tone. It was a formal demand for a financial settlement, written by a new attorney she had retained, claiming that Kate had invested significant time, labor, and personal resources into the upkeep of the car and should be compensated for her equitable share. Attached were spreadsheets, laughably amateurish, padded with vague entries like emotional toll of transportation and in-kind contributions. But they were presented with such confidence, such deliberate formality, that they almost seemed real at first glance. My lawyer Harris reviewed them, then looked at me with a dry smirk and said, "This is theater. Nothing more. But it's designed to rattle you. Don't let it." I didn't. At least not outwardly. But inside, I felt something shift. Not fear, not even anger, but a sense of surreal clarity. Like I had stepped through a door into a parallel version of my life, where truth was optional and narratives could be auctioned to the highest bidder. She was pushing for a settlement because she knew the court process was risky. She knew she didn't have a legal claim to the car, and every document, every payment record, every trace of my ownership backed that up. But the real goal wasn't the money. It was the spectacle, the legal pressure. The chance to say, look, he's so defensive he had to get a lawyer. It was a performance aimed not at winning, but at preserving the illusion that she was the one being wronged. We responded formally and without emotion, rejecting the claim and offering mediation if she truly believed there was a financial dispute, but under strict legal oversight, with recorded conversations and binding documentation. Predictably, that offer was ignored. Days passed, then a week, and then, just when I started to believe the silence might hold, she played her final card, or tried to. I received a call from a local journalist, a freelancer for a regional blog that often covered human interest stories and borderline gossip disguised as advocacy. He said he had been contacted by someone claiming to have information about a pattern of emotional abuse and coercive control in a recent breakup, and that I had been named. He wasn't accusatory. In fact, he sounded almost bored, like he was going through the motions, but he asked if I wanted to offer a comment before they moved forward with publishing. I told him no, that any publication of false and defamatory material would be met with legal action, and that I had a paper trail disproving the claims. He paused, said, "I figured you might say that," and hung up. I never found out whether Kate had actually planned for that story to go live, or whether it was a bluff, another attempt to keep the pressure on, to let me know that she could still touch my life if she wanted to. But something about that moment snapped a final thread inside me, not in a way that made me lose control or lash out, but in the sense that I finally stopped caring whether she ever understood what she'd done or why it was wrong. I had spent so much time trying to decode her motivations, to find the kernel of truth beneath the manipulation, to give her the benefit of the doubt, that I hadn't realized how little that mattered. Some people don't want resolution. They want the ability to destroy without accountability. And once you accept that, you stop trying to reason with them and start focusing on building the walls that keep them out permanently. I authorized Harris to move forward with a preemptive motion, a cease and desist against both her and her attorney, with a formal statement outlining that any further contact would be considered harassment. We also filed a small civil action, not because I needed financial damages, but because it allowed us to subpoena communication records if she pushed her luck again. It was a strategic move, one designed to reclaim initiative, to stop playing defense and start drawing boundaries with consequences. I expected her to push back, maybe to escalate further, but instead, for the first time, she disappeared completely. Not just from my inbox or my street corner, but from the internet. Her profiles were deleted or set to private. The mutual friends who had once fed me scraps of her movements went silent. Even the petty attempts at indirect contact, emails from burner accounts, cryptic DMs, blocked number calls, stopped. It was over. Not in a tidy, satisfying way. Not with an apology or a reckoning or some revelatory moment of mutual understanding. It ended because I made it impossible for her to continue without consequence. And when you take away the safety net of impunity, people like her tend to vanish, because their power was never real to begin with. It was borrowed, stolen, dependent on your silence and your patience and your unwillingness to be the villain in someone else's story, even when they're making you out to be one. In the weeks that followed, I started to reclaim small pieces of my life. I changed the locks again, not because I thought she'd come back, but because I needed the ritual of finality. I deleted old photos, not in a rage, but methodically, like I was closing a file I'd never need to open again. I even took the car on a short trip out of town, just to prove to myself that it was mine again in practice, not just on paper. The air inside it felt different now. Not clean exactly, but mine. And that was enough. They say trauma doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you different. And that's true. I'm not the same person I was before all this happened. I'm more guarded, more suspicious, less quick to give people the benefit of the doubt. But I'm also more deliberate. I don't apologize for protecting myself anymore. I don't flinch when people bring up conflict. I don't assume that silence means peace. I understand now that evil isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle, charming, even empathetic. And the only way to survive it is to trust your own version of the story, especially when someone else is working overtime to rewrite it. There's something peculiar about the moment you realize it's really over. Not the dramatic, cinematic "it's over" you might see in movies with shouted words and slammed doors, but the quiet, almost anticlimactic kind, where everything you were bracing for simply doesn't happen. There was no final confrontation, no apology, no vindication, no last-minute revelation that explained it all in some neat or satisfying way. It just stopped. The emails stopped. The calls stopped. The petty manipulations, the passive-aggressive provocations, the attempts to reclaim narrative control, they all faded. Not like an explosion, but like fog, dissipating in the heat of the morning sun. And with that absence came a strange kind of grief. Not for her, not for the relationship, but for the version of myself that had once believed things would end with understanding or closure. For the person who had once waited at the window hoping for someone to come back and explain why everything had gone so wrong. What I've come to understand is that closure doesn't arrive from outside. It doesn't come in the form of an apology, or recognition, or revenge, or raw justice wrapped in a courtroom ruling. It comes quietly from within when you finally stop needing answers and start accepting that some chapters will never make sense, no matter how long you stare at the pages. That was the hardest part for me. Not forgiving, because I never confused moving on with forgiveness, but letting go of the expectation that any part of this would be clean. It wasn't. It was messy and cruel and wildly unfair. But it was mine. My story. My experience. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a character in someone else's narrative. I felt like the author of my own again. The car was eventually paid off. I made the final payment quietly, without ceremony, without even telling anyone. I signed the paperwork, received the clean title, and stared at it for a long time. Not out of pride, not even relief, but something closer to disbelief. There it was, the very object that had been the battleground for so much manipulation and noise, reduced once again to what it had always been: a machine, a tool, a possession. And yet to me, it had become symbolic of everything I had reclaimed. Not just property, but identity, autonomy, and voice. It wasn't about the car. It never really was. It was about ownership in the deeper sense, the right to define what had happened, the ability to survive it, the courage to keep going even when no one clapped at the end. In the months that followed, I began piecing together a new kind of life, not by rushing into something new, not by rebounding or pretending nothing had happened, but by slowly reconstructing a sense of safety and self-worth. I stopped trying to explain the story to anyone who didn't already believe me. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, trying to find the precise moment when things turned. I stopped wondering whether she would ever face consequences or feel remorse. And in that stillness, I discovered something I hadn't expected: freedom. Not just from her, but from the narrative she had tried to trap me in. I no longer felt the need to prove anything. I no longer feared being misunderstood. I had the truth, I had the scars, and I had survived. Some people, when they hear parts of what happened, still ask if I miss her. I don't. What I miss is the illusion of connection, of safety, of shared purpose. But illusions are fragile, and once broken, they don't return. They haunt. What I miss isn't her. It's the version of myself that didn't yet know how dangerous someone can become when they feel entitled to your life. And even that, I don't miss it with longing. I miss it the way you might miss innocence, softly, distantly, without the desire to return. Because I'm not the same anymore. And honestly, I wouldn't want to be. Kate never reappeared. Not directly, anyway. Occasionally, I'd hear through someone I hadn't blocked that she'd moved on, reinvented herself again in another city, with new friends, maybe even a new partner. I didn't look. I didn't follow. I didn't care. Whatever story she told next, it wouldn't include me. And that was the greatest relief of all. Not that she was gone, but that I was no longer necessary to her performance. The spotlight had moved. The curtain had dropped. And I finally was off the stage. There's a temptation to end this with a message, a moral, a neat little takeaway that gives the pain a purpose. But the truth is more complicated. Not every wound leaves wisdom. Not every betrayal makes you stronger. Sometimes it just breaks you for a while. And then you get up, and you keep going. And eventually you find that you've built something sturdier in the rubble, not better, not prettier, but real. That's where I am now. Not healed in the way people talk about healing, but awake, aware, whole, in a way that has nothing to do with being untouched and everything to do with choosing over and over not to become what tried to break you.